So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another showcase of the new patch and to another one of these new maps which has given a faction their capital in a far more unique way than we've seen in the past, because here we see AGAMOUR, the capital of Rhudaur. Rhudaur haven't really had too many settlements to their name in the past, and indeed those that do exist have generally been part of tool sets that have been made for generic settlements with regards to campaigns. This one, however, is more handcrafted. I do actually remember being a part of an attempt to run this particular one quite a while ago, so this one's been in the running for quite some time, and it's nice to see Rhudaur get some time in the sun. It is worth saying as well that their overlords in AGAMOUR have their own capital, Cardolan, that has been overhauled as well. Mistrand has been changed up a little bit as well. This one was sent to me by Eclipse, and apparently this is going to be the last one that Eclipse sends to me for a while, or at least the last one that he is going to be running himself for a while. WK instead is going to be picking up the slack in that regard, but yes, it seems that a busy schedule does get the better of us all, and I can certainly sympathise in that sense. But this is obviously a settlement which is going to be a little bit less grandiose than some of the other more civilised factions that we have seen. Cardolan more recently, obviously a lot more wooden structures here. But in spite of the fact that it looks as though there's a fair amount of open space, it's actually a little bit more constricting and labyrinthine than you might think, and there's plenty of good opportunities here for Rhudaur to bottle the enemy up, and of course we all know about Rhudaur's ability with throwing projectiles and how savage they can be. This is going to be a 4v4 as well, I believe, so the defenders are going to have the numbers, certainly, to be able to withstand a bit of a beating, especially considering that Rhudaur themselves can, of course, field fairly large armies. We'll be going through the attackers first and foremost, however, starting off with Kuro over here. It's been a while actually since I've seen Kuro in one of these, so that's good to see. He's playing as the Principality of Cardolan. We've seen Cardolan a little bit of late as well. Cardolan, of course, have had a little bit of a makeover. In terms of their overall focuses as a faction, they haven't really changed too much. I think it's more of a visual change than anything else, outside of a few examples. Which is not too uncommon among many of the factions, in all fairness. They've maintained the same focuses, but have had certain little things tweaked, and obviously some of them, like Cardolan here, have had fairly substantial visual overhauls. Tharbad Toll Keepers, basic spears, able to withstand a fair amount of punishment from afar, of course, with those large shields, though, as tends to be the way with Cardolan, they do lack a little bit in terms of melee damage, especially considering the spear malice, and of course morale is also a potential issue, is always a potential issue with Cardolan, and that does maintain into this new patch as well, albeit as long as they don't take too much damage too quickly at the hands of those throwing projectiles Rhudaur do traffic in. They should be able to support themselves now that morale boosting units do work as intended. It's a little bit easier to avoid some of the pitfalls that Cardolan often fell into in the last patch. Cardolan archers here, the central Cardolan units of course have had a makeover, and they are much the better for it, I think. Standard Cardolan archers are fairly bulky in terms of the armour and shield value they have, so they're going to be very good at skirmishing with the enemy, especially when you consider the more lightly armoured nature of the wild men that they are going to be facing. Cardolan men-at-arms as well. Armour piercing is a little bit of a concern, certainly for the attackers here. If you're too reliant on your armour, then Rhudaur and potentially AGAMOUR. I don't think there's an AGAMOUR army on the defence, but we will see. Both of those factions, however, do have access to some really nasty armour-piercing tools, so being too reliant on armour can be a problem. But it's fine for your basic units to have that as their main trait, and indeed the Cardolan men-at-arms, as with most of the Western Kingdoms of men with their standard line infantry now, do have boosted numbers, and that greatly increases their effectiveness in a situation like this, especially with those big shields that the Cardolan infantry do traffic in. Some more Cardolan archers on the flanks, lots of Cardolan men-at-arms actually, so going for a very numbers heavy force here with all of these units carrying up the ladders. Tharbad Warhammers, again, this is I think the third battle, possibly this one will come out before the next one, so I won't reveal too much, but it does have a tendency that Cardolan have been directly opposing more lightly armoured factions as a general rule, so the Tharbad Warhammers not able to act to their maximum potential, albeit their baseline quality is still so high that it's not too much of a concern. Crossbows are of course something which in the game, just based on how Medieval 2 works and based on how Reforged has always been really at its base, crossbows are always going to be a very effective tool. If you are on the attack, it can be a little bit awkward to get them into place, especially given the terrain features that are on this map, so it's obviously a lot of elevation they're going to have to deal with, which is a potential concern. But if they can get them into position, attackers getting crossbows into place is one of the death knells of the defence most of the time. 2 trebuchets, interestingly enough. I mean, considering the fact that the trebuchet crew themselves are also pretty nasty with those warhammers, maybe not to the same level of the Tharbad warhammers, but still pretty damn nasty, and of course the trebuchet themselves can really bombard the settlement too. Cardolan sharpshooters, of course, macemen in melee, fairly bulky, not as expensive as the gatekeepers, though not as good all round either. And then a couple of units of these Wardens of Tir Gorthad here. Higher end pikemen, and they should do really well as the battle enters its concluding moments, if they are saved until then, because they can certainly hang with the best of what Rhudaur have to offer in that regard. Moving on, we have Froggy playing as the Hidden Valley of Imladris, so certainly a high quality force they are, though of course the elves can struggle when they're on the attack if they have to march into a nasty situation. Their lower numbers do hurt them in that regard. Swords of Rivendell here though, with the armour upgrade of course. They will trade pretty well against the rank and file of Rhudaur. They're a small unit though, but then that also implies that their quality relative to what they are is going to be pretty high. The lower armour values could be a concern, though Rhudaur are not the best when it comes to archery, and most throwing projectiles will make a mockery of a lot of armour anyway. We have here the Eldarenway Spearmen, of course a very expensive unit, though worth every penny as long as they don't get singled out by ranged units as well that can deal with them. Armour-piercing javelins and crossbows mostly. But the defensive value is going to be something which Rhudaur really do struggle to get through, while Rhudaur do have the armour-piercing to be able to challenge the Eldarenway's armour, which is also very substantial. Elves, of course, really do back that up with high melee defence as well. So if they can get themselves set, the elves, they should end up trading very well in melee with the wild men. More swords and more spears. We also have the Imladris sentries over here, a very popular unit of pikes, and rightly so. Elven pikes have a tendency to still do damage relatively quickly, considering the way that pikes work in this game as well. That is no mean feat. There aren't that many pikes that will do damage very quickly, and it's not too surprising perhaps to know that Imladris have one of them. Eldarenway Spearmen, Eldarenway Archers, who interestingly enough are already in range. I mean, that's a really good example of how Elven range really does work. The walls are pretty far off, and they have a terrain disadvantage, and yet they're already able to fire. Though I don't know if they're going to be able to trade efficiently, given Rhudaur do have the cover that the elves lack at the moment. Who's going to light a fire under Imladris to get moving quickly. Several units of the upgraded Imladris Guardians, they should do really well against Rhudaur as well. Once again, similar to the Eldarenway Spearmen, the armour piercing will work against them, but it's mostly going to be Rhudaur's defensive shortcomings, which allow the Imladris Guardians to be really dominant in most fights 1-to-1. Though it is worth saying, of course, that most fights that Imladris get into are not 1-to-1. Over here we have the Gwythi Myrdain, formerly the Smiths of Eregion. You can see they have been changed somewhat. They look a little bit sinister actually now with those hammers and with the shadowy eyes, but yes, they are now a dual-wielding unit, though the fact they still have their hammers means they are still going to maintain that armour piercing. Being a dual-wielder, though, does mean that they have better melee defence as well, so this should be a flat upgrade in all fairness. Once again, armour piercing is not necessarily the most important thing against the Hillmen, but again, at their baseline, similar to the Tharbad Warhammers, their quality levels are so high that it shouldn't matter too much. More sentries, we have a ballista in here as well for more artillery action, and it depends if they want to save it to shoot into infantry blobs or if they want to try and crumble the rather flimsy wooden walls right from the off. 3 units of the Eldarenway Swordmasters, and they should do very, very well against the lightly armoured foes against which they find themselves. Marching alongside Imladris, we have the Kingdom of Arthedain, played by Cannon Fodder. He's got 2 trebuchets as well, so this is a big investment in artillery for the attackers, but it will worry the defenders, this, because it does mean that to a certain extent they're going to have to sit and take the punishment that the attackers give out. Though it is a risk, of course. Artillery is a little bit of a lottery at the best of times. We have plenty of units of Evendim Spearmen, so they're obviously a cheap and cheerful unit of spears, not too dissimilar to the Tharbad Tollkeepers, though in many ways I think it might be interesting to compare the stats of the 2 units now, but obviously the shorts are probably not all that comfortable in these cold conditions, but they're going to be pushing up the ram. We have the Arthedain Men-at-Arms, which, again, nothing too spectacular with regards to what they're going to be capable of doing, similar to the Cardolan Swordsmen, though that boost in terms of numbers they have in comparison to the last patch really does make all the difference, I think, for the Western Kingdoms of Men and their units of line infantry now. It makes them much more useful than they were. Arthedain Men-at-Arms, more Arthedain Marksmen as well, similar story here as with the Cardolan Archers. They're going to be very good at skirmishing with the lighter archers against them. We have plenty of Arthedain Pikemen, so going for more of the basic units of pikes, but this is not unusual for Arthedain by any means. They have a real tendency to bring units such as this quite a lot. Wards of the North we have, obviously the steel bows that they traffic in. Very, very powerful, very, very high base damage. Again, armor piercing. Generally speaking, you want to be going after bodyguard tier units with armor piercing arrows. And Rhudaur do have some units at the high end against which that will be very useful. Guardians of the Scepter, a unit of course of this very high end sword and board infantry. I think they are the replacement to the dismounted Knights of Numinous, and the Knights of Numinous are now purely a mounted unit, I believe. Arthedain men-at-arms, and then we have some defenders of Fornost here at the back. When they were defending their own territory in Fornost, they struggled quite a lot at the hands of the trolls. We'll see if they can redeem themselves here. In theory, they should do quite well against most of what Rhudaur have to offer. Heavy swordsmen in general do quite well there. And finally, Tundra's Fox playing as a second Cardolan force, so another trebuchet here. Has he also gone for 2? No, it looks like... No, he has gone for 2. So 6 trebuchets on the field is a lot for the attackers, and that does also cut into their budget quite a bit. I mean, the artillery crew themselves are useful when all is said and done, but again, it's a big risk here. We'll see if it pays off. Cardolan archers here, Cardolan sharpshooters going for those numbers once again. The assassin class units, the Thieves of Tharbad, this is a unit class which in the previous version of the game was kind of difficult to utilise. I'm told they have been made better, though of course we'll need a big sample set of battles before we can actually judge that for ourselves. Gatekeepers, plenty of units of Cardolan men-at-arms once again going for those numbers to try and offset the fact they've gone for a lot of artillery. Tharbad Tollkeepers once again as well, also in that vein, and then some Warhammers and some Wardens of Tir Gorthad once again, so very similar to Kuro's army on the other side. Now then, moving into the settlement itself, we'll start off with Eclipse playing as one of the Rhudaur defending armies. Rhudaur swordsmen, they're going to struggle against a fair number of the opposition today. They are outclassed in terms of baseline quality by the Western Kingdom's heavier units of infantry, though they do have 20 or so men more. It is still not the greatest prospect for them, and of course the heavy swordsmen that Arthedain and Imladris have are a worry, but those numbers are the important thing ultimately, and Rhudaur were never going to win this in terms of finesse. They were always going to have to rely on numbers, some savagery and melee with the armor-piercing damage, and of course projectiles. In all fairness, the Rhudaur clansmen with the armour upgrade here do make for a decent bulwark. Spears do make for a slightly stronger defensive unit in that regard, especially with the big shield value and the upgraded armour, of course. We do have the Rhudaur marksmen up here as well. They've got a spear on their back now, which is more useful against cavalry, which of course is not really going to be a factor on this particular occasion. Plenty of Rhudaur marksmen ready to pepper the enemy as they move forward. And it's not as if there's an overwhelming number of archers for the attackers to try and bully the defenders, but it is still something where you'd imagine Rhudaur will want the attackers to be a little bit more aggressive and gung-ho so they can get them in the kill zone. Rhudaur clansmen, Etenmoor's troll hunters of course are going to be absolutely vital if Rhudaur are to be successful here. That armor-piercing damage that they're very well known for. More Rhudaur swordsmen WK also playing as a defending force. Rhudaur swordsmen, another very important unit, are going to be the Black Waltz here, a Berserker class unit. It does mean they're a little bit flimsy when their hit points are gone, but while those hit points are still up, that armor piercing is going to be very, very handy, especially against the their fellow Arnorian kingdoms. We shall see if they can stay alive long enough to lay down the effectiveness the defenders will need them to. More Rhudaur clans, and we also have the Arthedain pikemen going to be a vital defensive tool for the defenders as well. Of course, all of the attacking armies have got pikes to varying extents. The Arthedain pikemen are a very strong unit as well, though they won't be able to dominate a pike fight in the way that they can do against other opponents. Rhudaur clansmen, the Rangers of course are very, very strong in terms of the amount of base damage they now have. Mr. Sneakman bringing 2 units of Arthedain Rangers, and I actually think it's very good that they're facing off against Imladris, because they can do a lot of damage even to the elves. And the elves, of course, each one lost is a tragedy, and the Rangers will be able to inflict that with greater impunity. More Rhudaur marksmen, a glut of units down here as well. More Rhudaur swordsmen, several units of them with Arthedain pikemen to back them up. Lots of Rhudaur clansmen too, so Imladris are going to have to really slog their way through a lot of these units. Rhudaur marksmen already firing as well at the approaching Imladris forces, so there's going to be no grace period here. We're going to get right down to business. There's this other smaller section as well, with more Rhudaur clansmen and swordsmen. Unsurprising to see, perhaps, in a 4v4 like this, the defenders have to rely so heavily on basic swords and spears. It is also going to call into greater question how good Rhudaur's basic skirmishers can be as well. Moving further back into the layers over here, we have Rhudaur swordsmen, plenty more Rhudaur swordsmen, some unupgraded Rhudaur clansmen in here as well. They're going to be a little bit less effective, but still much the same sort of thing. Arthedain pikemen and Rhudaur marksmen, so some very narrow areas for the attackers to traverse over here. We have the Reforged javelins, still the same as they were, of course. Strong armour-piercing attacks at range and in melee, though they are a little bit vulnerable when it comes to their melee defense, so especially if they come up against the elves, that could be a problem. We have some Rhudaur swordsmen, and then at the base of this statue over here, which is of course a facsimile of the Rhudaur's general unit, we have some unlocalized placement text, a unit that they seem to share with Dunland, as we've seen in the past. Catapults, though, defending catapults could be absolutely vital against the artillery that the attackers are bringing to bear. Mevon being the final defender as well, with some Rhudaur clansmen. More Blackwolds to make our way further down as well. Plenty of Rhudaur swordsmen. More Arthedain pikemen. I don't imagine we're going to see anything too different over here. Rhudaur clansmen. We do have the Trollshaw axe throwers, another vital tool in Rhudaur's arsenal if they are to be successful here. Those throwing axes, of course, particularly savage, and especially at breaking up pike blocks, which the attackers are going to be somewhat reliant on, especially late on maybe. Rhudaur swordsmen, Arthedain berserkers, interesting to see them again, of course, the throwing projectile and then melee attacks. Rhudaur, I think, actually have undergone probably the fewest changes of, or one of the fewest changes of any faction in the game, but then they were already pretty effective at what they did. Basic Rhudaur axemen, armour piercing, like we said, going to be a vital cog in Rhudaur's machine. A couple of units of them with Arthedain pikemen among them. Then we've got some Rhudaur clansmen as well. And finally, wouldn't have been too far there, but here at the back, in the town centre, we have more Arthedain pikemen, we have more Arthedain berserkers, Reforged javelins. There's also a few more archers over here, so there's a huge amount of these Rhudaur marksmen on display today. And more Blackwolds as well. Interesting to see no Witchrealm enslavers on this occasion, but plenty of Blackwolds and plenty of numbers. So this may be one of the few occasions where the defenders actually hold a bit of a numbers advantage right from the start because of how numbers heavy they've gone. We'll see if that proves to be a wise choice, however, as we make our way to the front end of the settlement here in the south, and we shall get this show on the road right away. So we can get right down to business then, really, because there's no way that Imladris are going to be able to get out of range now of these Rhudaur marksmen without having to move all of their army back, so Froggy is going to have to make the first move whether his allies are ready or not. Imladris probably the one faction of the attackers that they would want to least be incurring early casualties and the first instances of attrition that the battlefield has to offer, given the fact that they are going to be a little bit lighter in terms of numbers. But having said that, if they do manage to get up into Imladris's, or into Rhudaur's face, then surely the quality that Imladris have to offer is going to be a real problem for many of the rank and file of Rhudaur, which they are relying quite heavy on. When we think back to that composition phase, there's a huge amount of the Rhudaur clansmen and Rhudaur swordsmen that they're going to be reliant upon. These are exactly the kind of units Imladris should be fairly comfortable against in melee terms, but Rhudaur making full use so far of their fortifications, basic and rudimentary though they may be. And of course it is as well. The rangers back here are going to be very, very useful in these first instances, having to loop their shots a little bit, which is not ideal, but that's a lot of very high base damage that is going to be coming Imladris' way. And even with that armour upgrade, these basic swords of Rivendell are still going to struggle. And this is one of those perhaps slightly rare situations where it doesn't really matter what Rhudaur hit, I think. Anything is going to be good kills because Imladris are not going to be able to sustain these kinds of losses for an extended period of time. At least not in the same way as potentially their allies may be able to as the Cardolan archers start to make their way forwards. And it looks rather menacing, this settlement, doesn't it, when you're attacking it from this angle in particular. Of a daunting task for Kuro's Cardolan army as they start to move forward, with a small expeditionary force with the main bulk of it attacking later. Already briefly mentioned as well how artillery heavy the attackers are today. I was kind of expecting at least one artillery piece from each of the Arnorian factions to start hammering away at the walls initially. Then they would be able to avoid some of the losses that Imladris have sustained. There's a lot of dead Rhudaur marksmen as well, however, so the Imladris archers have been given as good as they get, actually. doing some good damage to the units that were on the walls, though of course, relatively speaking, there's not a huge amount of dead Imladris forces, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things. I think actually Froggy will be fairly pleased with how this has gone. But of course we're in very, very early stages. Not wasting any time either, getting down off the walls and engaging with the waiting Rhudaur defenders at ground level as quickly as possible. Again, like I said, those swords of Rhudaur now should be very, very good individually against these kind of units, and also coming down off the wall. I mean, Elder Enway are a whole nother matter as well. They may be spears, so the spear malice is coming into effect, but against this level of Rhudaur soldier, surely things are not going to be looking that good for them in the long run. I mean, to be fair, there are Rhudaur axemen moving in, and they are trying to overwhelm the Elder Enway spearmen, whose pathing has gone a little bit awry by the looks of things. So perhaps the armour piercing and just overwhelming numbers, backing the elves into the corner, can have some good effects, and it does look as though that is what's happening. The other Elder Enway spearmen, meanwhile, linking up with the rest of the forces now, with Imladris Guardians pouring in through the gate that Froggy has just knocked down. And slowly but surely we are going to see Rhudaur start to struggle at holding on down here, unless they have the necessary support. The Rhudaur marksmen are in place, they can move. Yeah, if Arthedain Rangers getting into position up on that slightly raised terrain, shooting down over their own ranks into the elves is probably the best way to go about business here. Meanwhile, banking themselves up ready. Looking over here, different tactics being used by Rhudaur, not putting their archers up on the walls straight away, and instead maintaining their position with infantry first and foremost to try and contest to the walls potentially, but still slowly but surely moving their way into position. I mean, it's quite an organised look actually to the Cardolan army, which is nice. Over here, meanwhile, we are also going to see cannon fodder and Arthedain now start to make their way up, cresting over the top of the walls. Rhudaur swordsmen individually will struggle against the Arthedain men-at-arms, but of course they do have the advantage of already being in position, and Arthedain having to advance into the infantry over the ladders, which initially is not ideal for the attacking force, but they should clear a spot, and then with the second unit of infantry the walls should start to fall away. Rhudaur marksmen now leaving the front line as well. Artillery starting to fire in, but not going after fortifications, instead going after some blocks of infantry that are just in behind. Arthedain spearmen are uncontested really on this section of the wall. This is one foe, however, that the Rhudaur swordsmen will have an edge over in pure melee terms. The artillery skims overhead as well. And then finally we are seeing as well Cardolan archers utilising fire arrows. Rhudaur marksmen fleeing from the front line as well. Eclipse not really going to be defending the walls over here by the looks of things against Hunter's Fox. He's going to allow the outer fortification to be taken and instead use the terrain just in behind. This part of the battlefield also includes a rather narrow choke point to another layer of the walls. I mean, there are several sections to the settlement that Rhudaur can defend, and it's not a good idea to go full power on all of the layers. You need to pick and choose where to make your stands and where not to. Well, Arthedain Rangers firing down from on high. Well, that was actually a blank shot, how unfortunate. Through the gorge. Yeah, Cardolan men-at-arms, very much the same sort of thing as the Arthedain men-at-arms. Individually speaking, their gear is going to give them an edge over their brethren from the north. But they are also pretty exposed up here. We have yet to really see Rhudaur's throwing projectiles really come into the mix, so they're going to be saving those for later, which is by all means not the worst thing to be doing. Well, men-at-arms, some of them getting caught up on the battlements, so Rhudaur happy enough with that. Looks like artillery actually destroyed that gate. Forgot to bring a ram, did he? Well, yeah, time to move those rangers. They're in a good position, but you don't want to be up there when the artillery gets a good hit onto you. Meanwhile, pretty good banking up here on the defence by Mr. Sneakman, you have to say, with pikes on the front line as well now, and Imladris trying to answer with their own pikes, but they haven't really made the kind of progress I was initially expecting them to make, although this is scary times, because if that artillery, if that trebuchet is a long way off, it would be threading the needle, but if it does manage to hit centre mass into this Rhudaur force, Imladris will certainly will certainly have the edge in melee after that, but you're also likely to see a little bit of routing from the Northman. But yeah, good mix of pikes, armor-piercing axes. In the long run, Rhudaur will lose the first layer at the very least, but they can make it so that Imladris aren't really much use to the attackers later on, and the second layer becomes too much for their fairly depleted army to bear. But Froggy does have a few more units left in reserve, though they are a fair ways off. Yeah, those archers up there proving to be a very key facet of Rhudaur's defence here, shooting down into more exposed elven ranks. Eldarenway archers up on the walls now, pulling out their swords, looking like they have run out of ammunition as well. Not going to go all the way along the wall and try and circumvent the situation. Their quality is all well and good, but are they bringing it to bear in the most effective manner possible? Very similar story over here for Arthedain as well, though they are also pressurising by coming down off the walls. WK still holding them at bay, but again, Arthedain may not have the quality level of the elves in this initial assault, with it pretty much being entirely Arthedain men-at-arms over here. But they do have the numbers, and you can see that this is what's giving Rhudaur a cause for concern. It looks as though they are going to leave this area and save some of the more important units like the pikes, trying to siphon off as many of these units as they can. They're going to have to leave something behind as a rear guard, but this is where the domino effect may very well start to come into play. One front line starts to fall away, and that will give Cannon Fodder the opportunity to come to the aid of his allies. Even though this is a big settlement, the only ally he can really go to the aid of directly would be Imladris, because he'd have to go through a second layer if he wanted to meet up with Tundra's Fox over here, and he'd have to go through the entire settlement to meet up with Kuro. So there is that element of the settlement as well. The attackers are disparate from one another for most of it. It's really only when you get to the highest reaches of the settlement where they become one unified force, and at that point it's only one choke point they have to attack anyway. Cardolan men-at-arms doing a good job, as you would expect, the swordsman in this situation, even with the armour upgrade, being able to overcome the Rhudaur clansmen that have set up a defensive line on this hill. There are Rhudaur marksmen in reserve to offer a little bit of support, but Cardolan not really taking a huge amount of losses over here, but conversely neither of Rhudaur. This initial front line wasn't really the main focus anyway, and the Cardolan archers not going to have the opportunity to shoot into the side of the waiting Rhudaur forces. Rhudaur marksmen with just the one quill now. Also, they've got a very weird... There's a slight bug by the looks of things with their bow. They look very bizarre when they're shooting them. So getting hit in return by Cardolan archers, again, we've already mentioned, but skirmishing in this way, Rhudaur will have to win through sheer numbers, because again, the quality, the armour, is very much in question. How are Arthedain getting on over here? They are pushing through. Only one unit of Rhudaur swordsmen now stands between the Arthedainians and putting the second layer under some real pressure, but the Rhudaur swordsmen trying to move back into some sort of unified defensive position. This is the kind of momentum that Arthedain will be glad they have. Some of their units are shaken. They are being asked to do quite a lot after all. Let's see, that artillery, has it actually managed to score some telling hits yet? Not really, but slowly but surely we are seeing the kind of result we would expect, especially ever since the introduction of those Imladris pikemen. They have taken a lot of losses from afar, but they will have been making it more difficult for some of the more damaging Rhudaur infantry like these Axemen to have the kind of effect that they would have wanted to have. Going to do very poorly against those Elven swordsmen though. Several units of Imladris forces up on these walls as well. It's a bit of a strange engagement here with those Rhudaur swordsmen just sort of standing there gormlessly. But that's good for them, because as long as these Imladris forces get caught up on these walls, the easier they are to shoot down. Some out of ammunition Rhudaur marksmen now, utilising their spears. There's also the Trollshaw axe throwers in a very good position, so they've been doing some good damage, and that perhaps helps explain why so many of those pikes are dead. Throwing axe is ideal for killing off pikemen. Eldarenway archers pushing forwards as well. Imladris Guardians, there's not a huge amount left in reserve for Imladris, enough that they won't be horribly concerned for now, but they will be hoping that their allies perhaps don't have to take so many losses on the initial advance through the settlement. And in all fairness, that is certainly going to be the case for Cardolan over here. It's been a very different kind of battle between Eclipse and Tundra for now. Meanwhile, the more isolated portion of the settlement, we're seeing another engagement very much in this vein. Cardolan trying to spill through the gates with pike support, Rhudaur answering with their own pikes and infantry. And then here and there the odd force of infantry coming down off the walls. So it looks as though Rhudaur are actually doing quite well against Cardolan over here. Unfortunately for Kuro as well, like I said, he is the most isolated of all the attackers, so he's going to have to try and find a way on his own. He's not going to be able to really rely on any of his allies coming to his aid. Even if his allies start to make progress, the domino effect won't truly reach him until most of the settlement has been dealt with. So he is going to have to try and make his own way, and he has, I think, taken kind of similar losses to Imladris, and it may very well end up going a similar way, where Cardolan eventually manage to score some decisive hits on these Rhudaur defences, but for now, I think the defenders will be pretty pleased with how this has gone. Warns of Tir Gorthard, a very important pillar to all of this, however. Very good quality pikes this, and trying to go through with sheer numbers as well. Cardolan mass pushing with the Tharbad Toll Keepers. And they are able to cause some problems here for the Rhudaur line, so we arrived at the right time. Cardolan starting to turn the tide, make their own good fortune. Some marksmen in behind still firing away, but I think with that mass push, Rhudaur see the writing on the wall and they will start to retreat now, doing as much damage to Cardolan on the way back as they can. The artillery there firing way up into the air. Maybe trying to go after, again, this is where we may start to see the artillery focus of this replay start to truly come into effect. Catapults from the defenders, trebuchets from the attackers starting to fire here and there, but in all fairness, it's not been quite so manic in that regard as of yet than I would have expected. Starting to see a more all-in kind of fight now. Tundra's Fox moving forward, more of a glancing hit than you would have expected, considering it hit basically centre mass of this engagement. Artillery is one thing that can certainly cause Cardolan some worries, given their slightly lower mental fortitude than many of the other Western kingdoms. Cardolan men-at-arms, however, still having the edge in this kind of engagement. Wards of Tir Gorthad are a morale-boosting unit, I believe. And that effect does work now in this latest patch, so that is one way in which you can keep Cardolan pointing in the right direction. More marksmen just acting as fodder really on the front line. Ettenmore's troll hunters and try and get in position to use those javelins. I mean, that would be an ideal unit for helping to break up those Wardens of Tir Gorthad. But they are having to move into position relatively slowly. Meanwhile, Arthedain have been stopped, the momentum stifled. So they have managed to take this very lowest section of the settlement, but they haven't been able to push any further. And surely the Arthedain pikemen are one of the main reasons as to why.
Only half the enemy force remains.
Is that correct? Defeat is almost a certainty. Making our way over here meanwhile, what are Imladris up to? And the artillery now managing to get some good hits. This is what I think Imladris have been waiting for quite a while. One of his allies coming in to score some good, fairly decisive blows onto Rhudaur, but I mean, just looking at this situation, they do have the ballista, they do have another unit of pikes, Eldarenway swordmasters. Where are the Gwaithir Myrdain? Were they committed at some point? Have they been used and all killed? That would be most unfortunate. We haven't been able to see the very best that Imladris have to offer. Are they in here? Ah no, they are still out here. So yeah, Froggy has pretty much one fairly significant push left in him. I don't think he will need to do that. I think Rhudaur finally will have their resolve broken over here, but they've done enough damage to Imladris to the point where this has definitely been worth it. Mr. Sneakman really blunting the later effectiveness of Imladris is one of the best things you can do in this kind of situation. You don't want to have that elven quality bearing down on you in the late game with nothing you can do about it. Arthedain still struggling a little bit morale-wise. We haven't seen any mass routing from Cannon Fodder's army, but they've been threatening it for a while. Some of these more depleted units Again, and part of it may be the fact they don't really have any outstanding units on this front line. It's all marksmen, it's all men-at-arms. None of these units are particularly damaging. None of them are going to be particularly good at carving through Rhudaur really, really quickly, especially with pike support. Not seeing any defenders of Fornost or the like move forward. There's another runaway swordmasters over here as well. Cardolan is still... he has more left than Imladris do. So taking the slower approach and the opportunity to blitz through these defences was fairly narrow, and Rhudaur shut that door pretty quickly, so I think Arthedain are actually doing the right thing here. Marksman, I don't know necessarily if that's the best angle, but they are doing their thing. Swordsman. Cardolan able to clear up this defence over here, and now they have a choice. There are two pathways they can take. They can either go to what is in effect the third layer, or they can try and help clear out this second part. I would do the latter if I were them. Make life a little bit easier on their allies, help Imladris and Arthedain move forward, and then they can act in a more unified manner later in an effort to meet up with Kuro as the battle enters its latter stages. Systematic taking of the map. Cardolan archers. And that is something else that the Cardolan skirmishers do have in their favour as well. They do actually utilise their shields properly when they become a makeshift infantry unit. Stuff like Arthedain marksmen, of course, they don't have access to shields. Entirely armour focused, and yes, Cardolan men-at-arms are going to head this way, put a little bit more pressure on the main, we'll call it the working class districts of the settlement. There goes Mr. Sneakman's general, skewered by an elven spear. Rhudaur moving to meet them. Line infantry doesn't have the best charge anyway, so it's not too surprising to see that they didn't charge into one another, but sword to sword. Rhudaur's army compositions are such that there's plenty more where that came from. Is this the end of Rhudaur over here? It looks like it, yeah. Very depleted, routing, loss of a general, the stink clouds from the rotting meat that the trebuchets have thrown. Rhudaur still fighting up on the walls over here. Not completely giving up just yet, although if there's a way to get this unit of Rhudaur swordsmen out of here, I probably would. 130 fighting men for the latter stages of the battle could prove to be worth their weight in gold. We've seen very, very close battles in the past, after all. Decided by far fewer than that. Moving over here, meanwhile, Kuro has quite a long way to walk as he has to go around that pathway over there. I am interested to see, actually, that Rhudaur are continuing to put up resistance here in this part of the settlement. Cardolan archers doing their best, but the clansmen would defeat them in outright melee. Only a glancing hit on the Rhudaur marksman, but a hit nonetheless. The axe throwers, is difficult to keep track on the full effectiveness of units such as this, but we have seen snippets of them being the terror that they always were in the last version of the game as well. More hits on the Rhudaur marksman. Rhudaur axemen struggling a little bit, as you would expect. They are fairly fragile, and a more robust Cardolan force, spearheaded by those Wardens of Tir and Gorthad, are slowly but surely making progress through the settlement.
Only half the enemy force remains.
Is that correct? Just in behind Cardolan sharpshooters as well. That's certainly the sort of unit which we're going to struggle to really see the effectiveness of until the very end, when we start to see the outcome of the battlefield. But the settlement shape is such that it was always going to be fairly difficult for the attackers to get their crossbows into the best of positions, especially if the defenders are doing things properly, as has been mentioned. But even if they are having to loop their shots slightly, those crossbows are still capable of dishing out very, very substantial amounts of damage. Defeat a distinct possibility. Now then, they are making some efforts to move this way as well. Thieves of Tharbad. I think it's more trying to be as efficient as possible over here. Engage partially and then hope that the Thieves of Tharbad can cleave their way through these Rhudaur clansmen as best they can. I mean, the Thieves of Tharbad should be pretty good in melee against this kind of unit as well. Down over here, the pathway into the main section of the settlement. Rhudaur clansmen actually fighting very well on this front line. The pikes are not in the ideal formation.
The enemy are through the walls. Fight on. They must get no further.
Fortifications taking hits. I think that was more of an accidental one. Indeed it was. That over there. I suppose they can push their trebuchets in through that gap now, so maybe it wasn't accidental. But still, Rhudaur hold. The Cardolan sharpshooters in place, ready to shoot through any gap in their own infantry that may appear. I like the crest that Cardolan have now of the bridge. Tollkeepers indeed. Meanwhile, Eldarenway Swordmasters pushing through this other small section now they have retreated from again as a result of Arthedain and Imladris can work in tandem to a certain extent now, so they don't want to get hit in the rear by one or the other, so Rhudaur having to make their defence more of a flat line once again. Imladris Guardians, Eldarenway Spearmen and Archers on the front line, and still Rhudaur clogging up these defensive positions with a combination of their swords and spears. How many of these units can Imladris truly smash their way through before they ultimately run out of steam? I am unsure. Artillery streaking across the sky over there, probably going after the trebuchets, based on the position of that. Arthedain now committing their own pikes forward, which in all fairness Cameron Fodder was a little bit more cautious about than all of his allies were at moving through those gates, which could be to their benefit here. Rhudaur don't have pikes of their own at this stage on this front line, so Arthedain can try and bully them a little bit in that regard. But Rhudaur marksmen in a good position potentially to shoot into them. Arthedain men-at-arms in the background. There's also the damage spike that the Black Wolds offer you. Something else to potentially be concerned about. All it takes though is one of these front lines to start to fall, and you can already see here that Tundra's Fox is making some progress. Some Tollkeepers pushing their way through. If they can just finish off this one unit of Rhudaur clansmen from Eclipse, whether that's routing them off or killing them, they are then free to move forwards through this section, and that will force Rhudaur's hand. They will have to move backwards and cede yet more map control to Arthedain and Imladris over here. Cardolan will join up with them then, and then they, all three of them can start making their move on the wall we see in front of us, the next layer of the settlement. The settlement will start to constrict, however. Less space for Rhudaur to defend does mean they can focus their efforts a little bit more into stopping this momentum that the attackers are slowly starting to seize. Further over here, meanwhile, Cardolan have managed to push Rhudaur back to this one choke point now. Maybe a blessing in disguise for Rhudaur, honestly, although you can see their Trollshaw axe throwers going after the wards of Tir Gorthab once more. A few of them falling. And it's been a pretty bruising affair for Cardolan over here, though they are still marching forward. That trebuchet is doing damage as well. Rhudaur marksman continuing to take hits, but Mevin won't be too worried about the situation as it stands. He'll be very much fancying his chances, I think, of being able to hold on to this gatehouse over here. This is part of the same layer, really, that the wall on the other side is a part of as well, so by hook or by crook, the attackers are reasonably in sync with one another. Rhudaur clansmen doing a pretty good job over here as well. I mean, those catapult shots could be a real pain for Cardolan. Direct hits are definitely not good for their life expectancy. Rhudaur swordsmen fighting the front line. Meanwhile, I suppose they're lucky that it hit the trebuchet crew and not the trebuchet itself. I mean, in an artillery duel, based on the fact that the catapult is already set, it should be a fairly simple win for the Rhudaur artillery, this. Is it going to be? Trebuchets are big targets as well. Oof. Right into the heart of those units. I mean, yeah, they do smash one of the trebuchets to splinters and kill off more of the crew, quite a lot of the crew actually. Is it worth going point blank like this? Possibly. I mean, that is a lot of casualties they can inflict, and especially when it comes to those Arthedain pikemen, it's a fairly important unit that they can kill off en masse here. They do need to get another shot off before the next volley comes, however, otherwise they're very lucky there. That really ought to have been a hit. But artillery can be fickle. Unfortunately for Eclipse there, they do manage to smash the trebuchet now, but not before a very telling blow on that front line. And the Arthedain pikemen now fleeing. Big damage there, and Cardolan will now be able to force Rhudaur back behind the next palisade. Is that worth it? I don't know. I mean, they've got enough trebuchets to the point where they can bring forward another one, so maybe you could say it is worth it. Undoubtedly. This very depleted unit of Rhudaur clansmen. This definitely has the feel at this point of Rhudaur simply trying to buy as much time as possible. If they can just whittle the attackers down just a little bit more so, then the next layer may be the one that wins it for them. That may be the thinking. Defeat seems certain. They're over here, still holding on to these front lines. I have to say I'm a little bit surprised by that. Not for much longer. Overwhelming force is now being applied, but it's another situation where Rhudaur have managed to hold their ground just a little bit more than I was expecting them to. Maybe that is a good sign for them going later on into the battle. And that was threading the needle. Just saw that in the distance. Gate destroyed by the trebuchet. Does of course mean that they don't have to go and remount a ram, reorganise themselves in that regard. Blackwold's, of course, as any Berserker class unit, will simply fight to the bitter end. The Imladris will be one of the better choice of targets, though. It's not as if the Blackbolts will do no damage to these elves. Savage amounts of melee attack, armour piercing melee attack at that. How much do Imladris truly have left, though? Not much. Arthedain with a little bit more. They will be ready, however, to move forward the trebuchet crew. Of course, giving Arthedain a rather unlikely source of armour-piercing melee damage. Interesting that armour-piercing melee damage for Arthedain is always bound up within a unit whose main focus is something else. 9 Troll Slayers spring immediately to mind. Meanwhile, Cardolan Sharpshooters look like they've taken one hell of a beating over here. Continuing to slowly do damage to that Rhudaur front line as they block up their infantry in front of the gates. Trying to thread the needle and go after the catapult, are they? Managed to hit something, even if not the catapult. They managed to do a fair amount of damage to the crew and to the Rhudaur swordsmen that are in and amongst them. Again, trying to thread the needle a little bit, rotting meat. As Cardolan pass through these areas, it's probably going to be less great for them. Rhudaur marksmen moving forward to meet Cardolan's challenge, and speaking of Cardolan's challenge, they're actually being forced backwards at this point by Rhudaur. Not a good sign from their perspective. Throwing axes hitting the Tharbad Warhammers now as well, so it has been a very tough encounter for Cardolan over here. They can't afford to lose Tharbad Warhammers like this. We've yet to truly see the best of this unit in the patch. I mean, they haven't mechanically changed really, it's only visually. Visual upgrade or no, however, they won't want to continue to take uninterrupted throwing axe fire. Another unit of out of ammunition Cardolan archers, but is that going to be the answer? I mean, Rhudaur marksmen and Trollshaw axe throwers. Rhudaur's answer in melee at this point, bit of a wet noodle fight in terms of the quality of units that are being committed, but you can't help but feel as though Mavin has more left in the tank. I wonder who people are actually rooting for here. Do they go for the defenders even though they're evil, or do they go for the attackers because they're good? I don't know. I guess we'll see in the comments. Some lots of units still here, meanwhile. Oof. Again, artillery falling just short. These It's going to take a long time for them to do really telling damage with that amount of crossbow fire. There's a lot of arrow fire moving forwards as well. I think trying to go after the Wardens of Tir and Gorthad, very understandably. Yeah, definitely going after the Wardens of Tir and Gorthad. We have seen them be effective in this battle already, after all. Their armour will save them to a certain extent from basic archers like that, but not entirely. Now, marksman. What have we here? Yeah, they are pushing their way into this layer already. Cardolan may have been delayed, but these guys are not. That Trebuchet of Numenor crew, meanwhile, getting eviscerated at range by those Atenmoor's troll hunters. Seeing more of these javelins now, so the war being slightly contested, but the Rhudaur marksman really just here to act as a blocker for those troll slayers, or troll hunters I should say, to do the business. Arthedain taking the lead here. Rhudaur's metal being tested once more. Again though, Rhudaur pikemen at the heart of this. Rhudaur pikemen are actually slightly better than the standard Arthedain pikemen as well, let's not forget. Arthedain would have to dip into their Illuminous gate guards to overwhelm this unit, which they do not have on the field today, so they're going to have to rely on something else. They're going to have to get in and amongst the Rhudaur ranks, rely on something like heavy swordsmen. There's a few Eldarin right in there. I mean, defenders of Fornar are heading towards the front line, as we've already mentioned, struggled on their home turf, but they should be pretty ideal against most of the units Rhudaur have, certainly the ones that are on the field today. Standard Rhudaur swordsman not going to be ideal against this calibre of opposition. But they're not on their own. Backed up by pikes as they are, Atenmoor's troll hunters have run out of ammunition now, so now they're just going to have to be used as a reasonably armoured spearman, but everyone needs to do their bit. Crunching in from the side. And they're having some success at the moment, sort of getting in and amongst the pike formation. Without those troll hunters hammering away at the Arthedain units on the wall as well, they have committed some marksmen up here to, at the very least, contest the fortifications. If they can start moving along the wall as well, maybe get their own skirmishers up here, that would be the death knell for the Rhudaur defence, but they're a fair ways off from that at the moment. A lot of them still to carve their way through. Rhudaur marksmen getting down off the walls, electing to fight in front of the gates here, Eclipse, in this very narrow choke point. It's an interesting choice, but it does, I mean, the benefit that the choke point offers is also counterbalanced by the fact that Cardolan do have the ability to use their crossbows, and the Rhudaur forces don't have the cover of the palisade walls. So that is worth bearing in mind, and over the long haul, many of those crossbow bolts are going to result in kills. Especially against stuff like the Franaline pikemen, that's the sort of thing which can really add up come the end of a battle. The pike advantage is still held by Rhudaur for now. Balance of forces evenly matched. Cardolan still have plenty of reinforcements as well. Let's not forget that this was probably the least all-in of the initial battles, so Eclipse and Tundra should have the most as we move later into proceedings. Meanwhile, Cardolan finally forcing the opposition back to the walls, but they are now fighting inside the gate itself, swordsman to swordsman. Again, I think numbers-wise, I mean, Trebuchet of Numenor crew, 100 of them, there's not a small amount of hammer-wielding infantry, the Tharbad warhammers as well. 116 Wardens of Tir and Gorthad, so Cardolan do have more. We saw back here earlier, crossbows first and foremost among them, but again, much like Imladris over on the other side, I think they've got one big assault left in them, one sort of momentum shifting assault, if you will, left before they start to fall by the wayside a little bit, but Kuro's not done yet. It is interesting that Mebban's trying to counter-attack into this position. I wouldn't really recommend it. I think Cardolan, most of it may be archers, but when you've got the Trebuchet crew here with those hammers, I don't think it's going to end too well. Even for a fairly healthy unit of Rhudaur swordsmen, I think you're just throwing them into the meat grinder, really. As the snow continues to fall, they do have pikes that can be committed, rangers, melee defense and melee. Not the worst thing at all. Over here, meanwhile, Rhudaur continue to hold resolutely. Been really the theme of the battle so far is Rhudaur managing to doggedly hold on to these positions. Arthedain pikemen. The linchpin of this defence. And again, Cardolan archers are now up on this wall over here. Tundra's Fox doing a good thing by getting a unit over here, and they're in a fairly ideal place to offer support. They're not the most damaging archer in the world, but this should make a difference fairly quickly, I would have thought. It is where the Arthedain pikemen's shields will actually really start to earn their keep, but I don't think that will make the difference between victory and defeat here. I think that will only buy Rhudaur a little bit more time before ultimately they're going to have to make the decision to pull back, I think. That unit of archers proving to be a very important play indeed. Defenders of Fornost as well. Also showcasing their abilities in melee. Units moving in, shoring this line up. Rhudaur clansmen, again, those fairly big shields will be working overtime against the Cardolan archers on Overwatch. Those crossbows still slowly plugging away. The artillery crew has now been thrown into the mix. Just more warm bodies to try and stop the rot over here, but over time, surely those crossbows are going to have the desired effect. I mean, the artillery is also over here, and I don't believe Rhudaur have any... Oh no, they do. Trying to arc their shot a little bit. Fairly fortuitous hit there into the Cardolan men-at-arms, but surely it would be better to bring forward that catapult to snipe out yet another of Tundra's trebuchets, because I think this is now the only active trebuchet on the field. If it still has ammunition, given how artillery-centric the attackers were, if you can take this artillery out, I think by and large you'd have to say that it wasn't worth it, but if there is still the potential for that to change, you're going to have to keep an eye on that trebuchet. Tharbad Tollkeepers moving in to keep the front line ticking over nicely for the men of the west. Men of the south, I guess, in this case, when we're talking about Cardolan. What are they going to hit? Will try and hit. Go way over there. They managed to hit 2 units by the looks of things. The dense formation of those Attenmore's Troll Hunters and Rhudaur Swordsmen, that's actually a very good hit. Again, quite fortuitous, but Tundra's Fox won't care about that one bit. Given the hellscape they've had to march through. And now there's gatekeepers up on this wall over here. That is a concern. A few volleys from those higher end crossbows, and that will surely be the end of Rhudaur's resistance here on this defensive line. To be perpetually reloading. I mean, they've got the ideal arc of fire. Direct. I don't really know what they're doing there. Trying to go after... Well, they're trying to go after the Arthedain pikemen in the unit. As they're firing over here. I mean, I would just go Santa Mass. Probably just target those Rhudaur clansmen, and whatever you hit, and this front line will start to crumble away pretty quickly. I do like the fact that Cardolan have come over here, perhaps seeing that this is the weaker section, and it'll take them quite a while to break through this very narrow choke point that they're having to go through over here. They will manage it, and of course they are starting to seize the initiative now with those sharpshooters in tow, and the trebuchet means that reinforcements aren't going to want to come down this way. So it's only a matter of time before this area falls by the wayside. Will they have a fellow attacker to meet up with over on the other side? A very similar fight has now broken out over here, though again far more of a 1v1 kind of feel over on this side of the map between them and Kuro. As much as Kuro has been pushing through the settlement, it has been costing him in terms of numbers fairly consistently throughout the whole thing. The victory seems certain for Cardolan now. Those Wardens of Tir Gorthad and Tharbad Warhammers offering a level of quality perhaps that Rhudaur don't enjoy. Arthedain pikemen may be able to go toe-to-toe with the equivalent pikes that Cardolan have, but stuff like Rhudaur clansmen, Their chainmail will not save them from having all of their ribs caved in by those Tharbad warhammers, the finest and strongest warriors Cardolan has to offer. Pikes reshuffling themselves as Blackwolds, however. It's another damage spike that can be added to the situation. WK pushing his catapult back. You can see what Rhudaur are thinking long term here. They are going to move back to effectively the 4th layer. 5th if you're being pedantic. I guess you could say that there's a layer here as well if you want to bank up on those choke points, but I wouldn't suggest so. This battle has played out in the way that Rhudaur have had to pick and choose their defensive positions. They could have chosen different ones. I don't necessarily think they've chosen the wrong ones. There's these choke points here, as we just mentioned, that could have been used, but they won't ultimately, by the way that Rhudaur are setting themselves out. And of course, when you get to the town centre, there's nowhere left to retreat to. It's really a case of both sides throwing all that they have left at one another in an attempt to win overall, but there's still a fair ways in this battle to go. By no means finished. But what is finished is Rhudaur's resistance on this layer. They are starting to flood forth now. I mean, Rhudaur we saw in the town centre, they still have a fair amount remaining. The gates open for the sharpshooters. Tundras will now be able to move his entire army to start marching forward with Imladris and Arthedain, though mostly Arthedain. Imladris are very thin on the ground at this point. The less numbers focused elves, of course, on the attack. This is where they are much more at home on the defence with their quality approach, generally speaking, you would suggest. Reforged javelins firing from on high. I think just trying to bleed away at the attacker's manpower a little bit more before mounting that all or nothing defence for the TC. Balance of forces evening match. It's really hoppy, by the way. For such a snowy and wintry themed map. I'm recording this in June, and it is humid. I'm not used to the humidity, I must say. And Rhudaur are starting to cut their losses a little bit on the front line, retreating what they can to just in front of and behind the final gate position that they will be attempting to hold. Rhudaur swordsman, again, it's a little hemorrhaging manpower a little bit here by losing units such as this. And as much as they do have plenty of these units to utilise, we have seen throughout the battle that overall they have lacked that little bit of high-end quality in melee. We've seen Blackwolds utilised. It's not as if Rhudaur have no options in this regard, but we have seen the slightly more civilised factions with their crafts and their arms coming to the forefront here. Consistent progress through the settlement has been made as well. Swords. Blackwolds being added to the front line as well, so they're not giving them a free ride up this way, are they? First getting hit by javelins, now having to deal with a Berserker class unit in melee. No rest for the weary, and Arthedain are starting to look a little bit weary as well, it must be said. We may end up seeing Cardolan have to take the lead fully when everyone meets up. 64 Imladris sentries though in the late game, if it really comes down to it, and there's no projectiles left for Rhudaur, they will struggle to deal with a unit of pikes like that. There's still quite a lot of Wardens of Tyr and Gorthad as well. Late game pikes are one of those way markers that you can utilise to predict where a battle is going to be going. Having a look, yeah, Rhudaur, they are behind. They can mount a spirited defence, I think, but from this position I would back the attackers. From javelins, I mean, they are renowned really for being able to do a decent amount of damage in melee, but they're pretty fragile for such a high-end unit. Like, you always expect them to be able to take more punishment than they actually do. But those spiky war clubs, not exactly the sort of thing that the Cardolan men-at-arms will be too thrilled about coming into contact with. Slow but steady progress still being made though. Further along. Defeat seems certain for the Wardens of Tirngortha. That's a little bit surprising. Is there a range support coming in from anywhere? No, marksman. More Cardolan men-at-arms. Oof, those are definitely crossbow bolts, based on how densely packed together they are. And again, in melee, usually the Cardolan sharpshooters would be a decent final wave because of those maces, but of course the armor piercing in melee going to be less important against the more lightly armoured Kingdom of Rhudaur. Victory is almost a certainty. Imladris moving forward as well with some Eldraenway sword masters. Just the thing really for dealing with the Black Worlds, that level of quality, that level of base damage, exactly the sort of thing to exploit the very clear weaknesses that a unit like the Black Worlds have. The Warhorns of Rhudaur blare out. I mean, just having a look at what they have remaining. Reforged Javelins, Granadine Pikes that are healthy, some Black Worlds, good damage. Granadine Berserkers are back here, so they've got all the right units really. Pikes, bodyguard tier units, plenty of damage from the Black Worlds, so they've saved the right things. It's just whether or not they have enough of it to be able to withstand all that the attackers will bring to bear. It's only one choke point though, and that catapult is ever the great equaliser. Artillery is something that you can't really predict as easily as other units, as we've already seen in this battle. The catapult was unable to destroy the rather large target of the trebuchet before it was able to get one last very big hit off into a blob of Rhudaur infantry, but maybe fortune will go the other way as we advance towards the battle's final stages. Cardolan though struggling a little bit more so to really finish them off out here, and again it is the Reforged Javelins that are making this so difficult for a unit like the Cardolan men-at-arms. Would come the Arthedain men-at-arms. Further down. Defeat seems certain. And that's very surprising. Rhudaur swordsmen with victory seems certain when they're fighting face to face with a unit of good quality pikemen. Very confusing. Meanwhile, Granadine Rangers could get a rear charge here. That would not be bad at all. So Mebane not willing to give Cardolan a free ride up this hill. I mean, Granadine Berserkers, plenty of Rangers. The Granadine Berserkers' presence may mean actually that Rhudaur outright win over here, which would be a pretty big deal. Gatekeepers trying to get into place, however, and if they can shoot point blank, that will be a real problem. I don't think Cardolan have anything left on this side of the gate. They don't. There's a huge pile of corpses there, but Cardolan, everything they have left is over here now. Looking in a fairly sorry state, although it does look as though Mebane is going to retreat now. Not wanting to take the full risk by the looks of it. Going to save his Berserkers and his Rangers for the final stand. He could have been bold there, but I can kind of see why not. I mean, we are starting to see far more movement now as Tundra's Fox leading the way with his own Cardolan force, and they would have cut off those units, and one Granadine Berserker and two Granadine Rangers could be the difference between victory and defeat here. They're going to need all of those units to boldly defend the front line. I don't know if are the Gwythi Myrdanes still alive? I mean, we haven't really noted them. We've seen the Tharbad Warhammers, we've seen pretty much every other high quality unit the elves have to offer. No, they are still here. Foggy does have that. That's a big spike of Imladris quality that can be brought to bear in the late game there. That will be worrying Rhudaur slightly. They're not going to be able to win this in terms of sheer martial might. They're going to have to rely on their ranged support, speaking of which. Some of these units up on the walls firing away. The Rhudaur marksmen with their funky bows. don't know which army that would be. I guess maybe Tundra at this point has finally dipped below half, because certainly the other three armies will have dipped below half a while ago. Kuro has very little left. Imladris have got some good quality stuff left, but not much in terms of numbers. The ram being pushed forwards. Still Reforged javelins left alive. And I said that they're usually quite fragile, as if to prove me wrong, they've had one of their more impressive melee performances here, though we haven't really seen them in the new patch, to be fair, so maybe this is merely the new version of this unit that we are seeing. New and improved, better than ever. And going after these units against which they are effective. Thought about Tollkeepers pushing the ram. 136 of them, although the gate is already open, it must be said. And the final phase, I guess, getting underway, but it's going to be a long old path, this, for the attackers. It's going to be bruising. This is going to end very close, I think. Neither side will be feeling hyper confident about the situation going into the late game. I don't know necessarily how much ammunition that artillery even has. It may have none, or just one or two shots. If it's got a lot of ammunition left, then this may end up being a pretty bruising affair. But they do have artillery of their own here, the attackers, with that ballista. And those are walls that can be crumbled. The trebuchet as well, so interesting times. They have to move their artillery, however, in slightly more difficult ways than the defenders, but we shall see. Finally, being overwhelmed, a few arrows coming from the still Rhudaur held part of the settlement. Trebuchet crew. The slightly darker colours of Arthedain, comparatively speaking to the lighter greens of Cardolan. Haven't really been able to clear too much of a space here at Arthedain. Blackwald's the reinforcing unit, as are the Reforged javelins. Some elves getting up onto the walls. There are only 7 Elder Enway swordmasters, but especially if they're being ignored by the Rhudaur marksmen, they're going to pretty quickly advance their way along here, killing as they go. Defeat seems certain. The defenders of Fornost. Good battle for them as well, I would suggest. I mean, stuff like the Arthedain Rangers won't enjoy being up against them. The Arthedain Pikemen, such an important unit here in the latter stages for Rhudaur. The ram unneeded for now, but then the gate could shut. If this attack does start to fall apart, the gate could close behind units or in front of a reinforcing column. That would be most embarrassing as well. That would be a fairly crippling thing, actually, to the attackers, I fear. Pretty messy, this. The pikes sort of bunching up and around themselves. 2 swords of Rivendell up here also. And they really are just making their way through this unit of marksmen. And every man counts, after all. Arthedain Rangers, do they still have ammunition, or are they simply occupying the wall so that the enemy can't so easily flank them? Possibly. There's one defender of Fornost who immediately has his guts spilled by one of the Rangers. Yeah, and they could go around, I suppose. Each defensive positions. I mean, based on how linear this fight is at this point, I think we will go up to ×2 speed, at least on a temporary basis, because so far the attackers are only committing forward units in drips and drabs, and that means that the pikes are able to fairly easily hold the line. I think we will go up to the point where it's the final 10k frames before rejoining at 1 speed on a more full-time basis. There's also some Arthedain men-at-arms up here now. Again, these units so depleted, but the Rhudaur marksmen also completely ignoring them. Have to respect the confidence. Actually. Cardolan sharpshooters trying to kind of mass push their way in. They didn't fully commit to that though. So I don't know if that's going to prove to be good in the long run or not. They have cleared out a little bit more space for the Arthedain pikemen to try and anchor this push in place. We did mention how important supporting units are going to be, and it's not as if Rhudaur have got tons and tons of ammunition that they can use here. These Rhudaur berserkers are waiting for their moment, which is now. They are going to do a fair amount of damage, but how much of this are they truly going to be able to sustain? Because they're going to need to sustain it for a bit at least. Reforged javelins up on the wall would probably be a play as well. Get a nice clear shot into the attacking forces. Gorthab, and also the Elven pikes as well, so all of the attacking pikes are in here. Ooh. They hit some units, but they also got a little bit of friendly fire there, and that is not what Rhudaur need. The artillery gods have not been on Rhudaur's side today, but perhaps they may yet change their mind. There's another Rhudaur general. Is that the sort of thing they can really afford? They can't rout off completely Rhudaur, and in the grand scheme of things you may think, well, the town centre's right there, but there is also the bug of units perpetually routing in the TC. I mean, think like 49 Rhudaur clansmen could be pretty useful. They just got hit, so they have actually been bounced back into existence, so to speak, but it is awkward. Meanwhile, the combined elven and human pikes for Wooden Mentor trying to make advantage of the, or trying to take advantage of the percentage lead they have here, the attackers. Trying to break the spirit of the defenders as thoroughly as they are able. The defending pikes doing their best. The Blackwolds, if they can get in and amongst these attacking pikes, the Blackwolds are exactly the sort of thing which can do damage pretty damn quickly, and they are up on the walls now. This is exactly the position I was looking at for them, and they're going to do a lot of damage actually. This could be a bit of a watershed moment in the battle, because those javelins are very, very damaging, and those pikes are getting devastated. All of the gains that the attackers just made are going to be significantly curtailed by that. The question is how much in the way of reinforcements they still have. I mean, they've got units out here, but when you look at them, Guardians of the Scepter and Dunedain Troll Slayers, Arthedain have got some high quality stuff, as have Imladris, Cardolan, a little bit more all over the place in terms of quality for them. But Rhudaur will definitely be pretty pleased with shrugging off yet another assault. Although the Reforged Javelins are now going to be engaged in melee by Elder Enway Swordmasters, and this is not an ideal fight for them, but they will give it all they've got, I'm sure. More reinforcements moving in, out of ammunition, archers just trying to keep the fires alive. As now the Rhudaur pikes start to close in, try and squeeze the life out of this assault. Defeat seems certain, only a military genius could win this battle. I mean, this attack is in danger a little bit of completely falling away. We've got the artillery crew up on the walls. We did briefly hear about how they've stacked up some ladders. Tharbad Warhammers, what's left of them from Kuro. They're going to be followed through as well by a more numerous unit of Tharbad Tollkeepers. So they are going to surely take this section of wall now. This unit of Rhudaur marksmen has lived a rather charmed existence up to now anyway. And they are going to fall away. Plenty of those hammers raining down the Trebuchet crew with Tharbad Warhammers. Rhudaur, though, on ground level, are forcing the attackers back. Now we need to do something. What's going on over here? Is that the catapult shooting at them then? I would be very careful if I were this catapult. I mean, you're already winning on the gatehouse. If you're going after the units on the wall, it's a different matter entirely. Rotting meat. Is that a sign they're out of ammunition with the catapult? Sometimes players are pretty savvy with that, and they use it to try and lulled the opposition into a false sense of security regarding the ammunition. I don't know if that's what's happening here. The warhorns continue to blaze. And still, yeah, this attack has stalled a little bit. They need to regather themselves and try and use what quality they have left. And yeah, Guardians of the Scepter moving forward as a vanguard type of unit. They're very defensive. I mean, honestly, probably not ideal going into a unit like the Blackwolves, but they need a unit of genuine quality that's going to be able to withstand some punishment so that they can reignite this attack, really. Those pikes still in decent enough numbers here. Rotting meat being used on the walls. To be fair, Tharbad Tollkeepers are more likely to rout than most of the remaining attacking units. Thieves. Gatekeepers, I mean 2 units of Gatekeepers, 1 from each Cardolan player. If they can get up onto the walls and start shooting down, I mean we've said time and time again in the past, if attackers can get their crossbows up onto the fortifications and turn them against the defenders, that's pretty much GG. Regardless of when it happens in the battle, you can always kind of tell where the battle is going after that. Whether they're going to be allowed to do that though, I'm not so sure. I would still back the attackers in a position like this, knowing what I've seen in the past. The level of quality they still have. Tharbad Warhammers are here. You can see the unupgraded version of them still here in the game. And you've got the Gwythi Myrdain, of course. A return to their more silvered armour. Trebuchet Rhudaur, are they truly going to start making gains? I mean, Guardians of the Scepter moving in. I must say, as much as I kind of like the idea of the Guardians of the Scepter, I think it would have been more prudent perhaps to make them kind of a mace unit and keep the dismounted Knights of Illuminus as the sword and shield unit. But that's just me. As for the Guardians of the Scepter, they are absolutely vital to the attackers' continued efforts here, but there's still so many of these pikes, and I mean it's difficult to dislodge pikes in this kind of position, given what is actually going on here, but they need to get another set of ladders up here, I think, and really test them. Send the Gwythi Myrdain or the Tharbad Warhammers up here and try and batter the Ferodrum Javelins out of the way. It's a huge stink cloud over on this side. Tharbad Tollkeepers, finally, I mean these Rhudaur marksmen, initially it looked like they were going to die to a mere 6 elves, and they've since then actually withstood an almighty assault, but that is almost certainly coming to an end now. Arthedain Berserkers. Well, I think that was a Cardolan general. Tharbad Warhammers are up here after all, so Kuro's general gone. Cardolan will suffer from the loss of their general more so than the other attackers today, but I think at this stage in proceedings, such things are probably not going to be the difference maker. If Cardolan were going to rout, the presence of the general wouldn't stop that, I think. At least with the level of shock that it's going to require to actually induce a lot of routing here and now. Another Rhudaur general falls. Just like Arthedain Berserkers up on the wall. Yeah, Eclipse's general. There's actually another general right there as well. No, that's Eclipse's general. So Eclipse, the only defender that still has their general left, and he's on the walls, fighting directly. Gatekeepers still. They're not really making a huge amount of progress here though, the attackers. Momentum has stagnated somewhat, even though they should have all of the tools to be able to win this fight. But numbers wise, I mean, they do have to be a little bit careful. If they don't have the numbers, they're not going to be able to splinter that pike formation, and Rhudaur will just be able to slowly bleed the attackers out of the wrists. There goes Eclipse's general though as well, so Rhudaur now no longer have any generals tying their army together. And the Gatekeeper's strong enough in melee, but their armour-piercing attacks go to waste. Their own armour will be counteracted by the armour-piercing of the Reforged javelins and the black bolts. Tharbad Tollkeepers now going to be able to open up a new front line. The catapult crew, having flung all its rotten meat, is now a melee unit, and they will block the advance of the Cardolan spears. Cardolan Berserkers still doing their thing. The use of Tharbad getting up onto the walls. Big gap that the Tharbad Tollkeepers have made, trying to deal with what remains of the Tharbad or the Arthedain Berserkers. Would come some more quality now. The Imladris, Imladris, trying to make the decisive move. I mean, if Rhudaur do win this, it will be entirely on the back of their pikemen at this point. And they do have the pike advantage, that push that the attackers made with all of their pikes, which was soundly beaten by the volleys from the Reforged javelins. We will look back on that as the key moment of the entire battle, I think, if Rhudaur were able to hold out, which, as I've said, I doubt they will be able to, even though the pikes can keep higher quality units than themselves at bay. It's going to be very hard for them in this situation, I think. Not impossible, but we'll see. Strange things have happened, but yeah, Thieves of Tharbad are up on the walls, throwing their projectiles down into these units now. They still have a unit of Arthedain Berserkers in reserve, Rhudaur, so a bit of quality left. The artillery crew as well have, with the assistance of a few pikes, have managed to contain the Tharbad Tollkeepers, so this little flanking motion hasn't really achieved too much. And they're going to try and close down those Tharbad thieves now. Arthedain Berserkers going to try and do the same thing. And Gatekeepers, the Troll Slayers and Wards of the North still being in reserve as well is a problem. I don't know if the Troll Slayers and Wards of the North still have ammunition. We haven't actually seen them do anything up until this point in the battle. They may simply be the less of a straw that breaks the camel's back and more of an anvil when you consider the quality of unit that they are, but still, considering the fact that they were down percentage-wise, I think this has been a valiant effort from Rhudaur, even if they do go on to lose this. I mean, they were about 10 percentage points now, now it's only 3. And the attackers do need to try and find a way to get around these pikes, but pikes are in every direction here. I think mass pushing would probably be the way to do it, just commit everything all at once, and it's something we've seen evil factions, particularly orcish ones, do time and time again to great effectiveness. This is one of the few situations where the Arnorians and the Elves may want to engage in that kind of tactic to finally turn the screw. The Ballista crew, 18 remain. Arthedain Berserkers still have ammunition, that's a factor I hadn't really considered. The Imladris, still 46 of them. I mean, again, that melee defense is going to be a real problem. They're not going to be able to be killed quickly outside of those throwing axes of the Arthedain Berserkers. And the Ballista crew is going to be trying to just get in there to disrupt their firing rhythm. And there are holes now as well. The pikes are no longer all-encompassing. And those gaps should be being taken advantage of, in my opinion, by the attackers, but it's not the be-all and end-all, I think, at this stage. Wards of the North arriving on the walls as well. Finally should be enough to deal with what very little remains of those Arthedain Berserkers. Ballista crew. Oh, that's interesting. The Ballista crew is enough to do that? Not really any... Yeah, I was going to say, there's not actually any attacking units in there as such. A very peculiar situation there. The unlocalized placement text. Unfortunately, I think this may be a bit beyond their capabilities to rescue Rhudaur's prospects. I mean, as we take a look at the final stages, I mean, what could Rhudaur have done differently? It's hard to say, really. I think they did very well against Imladris to blunt them early on. I think that maybe down there against Arthedain, it was initially not great, but then they really did stifle the momentum, so I don't really... Like, there was no engagement, really, I think Rhudaur performed poorly in. I think it might just be a case here, more than anything. They went for a numbers-heavy composition, but maybe they just needed a little bit more quality here in the long run. They had a lot of quality with their pikes, Cardolan Berserkers and Reforged Javelins, but maybe if you were to trade in, say, 2 units of Rhudaur Swordsmen and 1 unit of Rhudaur Clansmen, so 3 units of high numbers infantry for 2 Witch Realm Enslavers, far less numbers individually, but especially with the armour-piercing bites that they have, which would be so useful for mowing through, especially the Arnorians, which are more reliant on their armour than the Elves. Maybe that could have made a big difference, but that does take away quite heavily from the numbers. You are effectively losing 450 to 500 men at that point in favour of some high-end quality, but I don't know, maybe that's it, maybe it's a... But I do think with this one it's more a debate about composition rather than how the defenders played, really, because I don't think any of their decisions were outright wrong or questionable, and they did make it work for themselves most of the time. To the north are actually firing away, so they do have ammunition. They haven't really been active in that regard. Steel bows really are turning the screw now, the attackers, showing no mercy to the Witch King's minions. And after this, I guess onwards to Cardolan once they've reinforced themselves. Cardolan, of course, does have a new variant as well, which we may see in the coming weeks. Then we may actually see the old version of Cardolan first. I think that may be the swan song of the old patch, which is going to be coming up in the next couple of weeks. Isn't that something? Gatekeepers as well, Gatekeepers, Wards of the North, all that stuff, and yeah, I think at this point we can safely go up to ×2 speed. It really is just going to be a case of how long the attackers want to take over this, and of course we can tell based on the amount of frames left in the battle, but like I said, Rhudaur did a good job, but it's always going to be quite difficult, especially when you've got the varied strengths and weaknesses that Imladris, Arthedain and Cardolan all bring to the table, natural allies, and they do cover for one another's weaknesses quite well actually when you consider it. Cardolan with their crossbows and some of their high-end armour-piercing options, shall we say, the other two don't have. Well, actually Imladris do, but Imladris of course bring the quality, but lack the numbers. Arthedain with their archer options. There's a lot of good stuff there. Rhudaur on the other hand, the armour piercing, the throwing projectiles, strong, scary as well. And we saw just how devastating it can be on more than one occasion here. And Tharbad Warhammers in the vanguard. Gwaithir, how many of them are left? Not many by the looks of things, only 3, so they paid the price, but they were ultimately the thing which truly turned the tide for good against Rhudaur. So that's a feather to Imladris' cap. And that is going to be that. I don't really know. I think it's going to be a case of search and destroy here. But there we have it. And that was AGAMOUR. I think I'm saying that correctly. Rhudaur's capital. We've seen a few Rhudaur themed maps in the past, though no settlements that were as comprehensive as this. And I like the look of it as well. Pretty big, very layered. I actually, mechanically, this may be one of my favourite maps just in terms of its overall layout, just because the defenders have got so many different ways they can approach it, and all of them can work just as effectively as one another. Whereas with a lot of these siege maps as we've seen, in particular some of the ones that we've seen time and time again, there's a very set way to play it. Whereas with this one, I feel as though there's a little bit more that can work out differently, and that's true for quite a few of the new maps actually. I like the fact that that seems to be the case. it bodes well. And hopefully soon we shall see the other two big set-piece maps, which I know have been made, are of course Cardolan, Angmar's capital, and Mistrand, Rune's capital. So we may get to see those in the near future as well. But big thank you to Eclipse for sending this one to me. Like I said, he said that this is probably going to be the last one that he sends to me for a while. Now I don't know whether that means he's not running these battles and he's not going to be a part of these replays for a bit because of work, or whether it's because he's not actually making the maps. He will still join him as part of games, but the actual map creation is going to be left more in the hands of WK here, who I believe did make Mistrand and Cardoon, so that's worth bearing in mind as we move forward. But hopefully we still see Eclipse here and there, because he is obviously one of the mainstays. And yeah, so let's see what did the damage for Rhudaur. We've got Arthedain Berserkers doing reasonably well. The Arthedain Pikemen were obviously a real linchpin, like we said, defensively. Pikes, you rarely expect them to get tons and tons of kills, but as a defensive bulwark, they're very, very important, and Rhudaur certainly lent on them quite heavily here. Troll Hunter's doing quite well. As you would expect, the difference in performance from some of the clansmen and swordsmen, it's going to be quite mixed. Some of them are going to do very well, some of them are going to do quite poorly, but then that's the nature of the beast when it comes to some of these more basic units. The Catapult, 362 kills, that's impressive. The Reforged Javelins as well, 329. That is a very good return for a unit like that, but then they are fairly expensive, so you'd hope so. Mr. Sneakman getting less kills, but you'd expect that because he went pretty much all in against Imladris early on, which means you're going to get less impressive numbers in regards to casualties inflicted, but the quality of these kills, generally speaking, is going to be quite high, and the Arthedain Rangers were used early, and both broke 100 kills, so that is good for them. The Trollshot Axtor is doing that as well. WK, more impressive numbers here, but again, you would expect that given the fact that he was facing off against a more numerous force. Rhudaur Marksman and Swordsman breaking 200 kills, that's impressive, and Clansman. So his rank and file actually did very, very well for themselves, which is not bad at all. Arthedain Pikemen doing well, Blackwald's okay, Arthedain Berserker's okay as well. A lot of units breaking 100 here. Goes to show how numbers heavy Arthedain went, I suppose. And then Mevin, Arthedain Berserkers breaking 300, that's impressive. The Rangers breaking 200 is good as well. Many of those hits that they land will result in kills because of their very high base damage after all. Yeah, plenty breaking 100, a few breaking 200 as well. Rhudaur Axemen, that's not bad, 199 and 202, given how fragile they are. Very much a flash in the pan kind of unit, but doing decently. But in the end, in spite of all of this, it's not quite enough for them to be victorious, and they did deploy more men when you look at it like that. Each of those armies is fairly large. They all went numbers heavy. Like I said, maybe a little bit more quality, maybe a couple of Witch Realm Enslavers could have made the difference, but we'll never know. This is one of those where it's going to be a case of small things changing across the whole map could have made the difference, but I do think the attackers were worthy victors in the end. They managed to maintain the momentum of their attack throughout the battle. It wasn't a quick blitzkrieg like it usually is with a faction like Mordor or Angmar. It had to be a slower push because of the nature of the attackers today, but they still executed on that very, very well, I thought. Look at the kills for Imladris as well, nearly 5,000. I'm sure people will be quite pleased with their performance today, in spite of the slog that it was for the elves. They were still able to flex their muscles a little bit. I think Cardolan were impressive as well, actually. Kuro, isolated as he was, and Tundra having to take the slower approach. I think Cardolan, especially with the numbers they brought to the table late on, were key. And then Cannon Fodder with Arthedain. Early on, it looked like it was going to be a fast affair for him, but then he had to readjust and slow down a little bit. So it's one of those. It's an interesting situation, isn't it? But yeah, big thank you to Eclipse for sending this one in and making this map. And hopefully his hiatus is not indefinite from creating maps like this, because you know, we've seen many a good creation in the past, and it would be a real shame if this was to be the last one for good. But I doubt that's the case. I think it's just a small hiatus, like I said. Big thanks to all the players for being a part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.